Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Greta Zaro and I'm the organizing director for World Beyond War. World Beyond War is a global grassroots network of volunteers, activists, and allied organizations around the world advocating for the abolition of war and its replacement with a just and sustainable peace. Today's webinar is all about the AGSS, and we'll explain what that means in a second. This webinar is part of our ongoing educational webinar series. We've covered numerous topics from divestment to closing military bases to the role of militarism in the media, as well as how war threatens the environment, and many more topics. All of our webinars are available for free viewing on World Beyond War's YouTube channel and also on our website at WorldBeyondWar.org/education. So today's webinar is all about the AGSS. What's that? Well, it's World Beyond War's book, A Global Security System, an Alternative to War, which provides a blueprint for the strategies needed to demilitarize security, manage conflict non-violently, and create what we call a culture of peace. On this webinar, we are joined by Phill Gittins, who is World Beyond War's Education Director, and Tony Jenkins, who is a former Education Director of World Beyond War from 2017 to 2019. So today we will explain the nuts and bolts of this alternative global security system, the frameworks, processes, tools, and institutions necessary for dismantling the war machine and replacing it with a peace system based on common security. Let me introduce today's guests. First, we have Phill Gittins, PhD, who is World Beyond War's Education Director. He has 15 years of experience in programming, analysis, and leadership in the areas of peace, education, and youth. He has particular expertise in context-specific approaches to peace programming, peace-building education, as well as youth inclusion in research and education. He holds a PhD in International Conflict Analysis, an MA in Education, and a BA in Youth and Community Studies. Phill has received multiple awards for his contributions to peace and conflict work, including the Rotary Peace Fellowship. Welcome, Phill. Our next guest is Tony Jenkins, PhD, who has 15 years of experience directing and designing peace-building and international education programs and projects and leadership in the international development of peace studies and peace education. Tony is currently a full-time lecturer in Justice and Peace Studies at Georgetown University. He is a former Education Director of World Beyond War and a current advisory board member of World Beyond War. Since 2001, he has served as a managing director of the International Institute on Peace Education, and since 2007 as the coordinator for the Global Campaign for Peace Education. Welcome, Tony.
Thanks, Greta. Great to be here.
And as always, we are also joined by World Beyond War staff member Mark Elliott Stein, who will be assisting today with moderating the Q&A. Welcome, Mark.
Welcome. Thanks, everybody.
So all of the participants, you are currently muted, and we will unmute you at the end when you will have an opportunity for Q&A and discussion. So hang tight for now. We're going to jump into the presentation, and then we'll follow that with discussion. And feel free, if you are joining us on Facebook or on Zoom on your computer, feel free to type in questions in the chat box at any time. And now I'll turn it over to you, Tony.
I think it's turning over to me, Greta. Is that right? Turning it over to Phill.
There you go, Phill. Get us started.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Greta, and thank you to everybody around the world there, wherever you're calling in from, for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and we're very much looking forward to sharing a little bit about the AGSS. We really want to begin with the end in mind. So by the end of our time together, we want to have accomplished two things. One, you will have a better understanding of the work that World Beyond War do in general, and also a better understanding of what we mean by AGSS and all of its moving components. The second thing we want to accomplish today is that you walk away with increased understanding and awareness of the possibilities for turning some of the elements covered here today into action on the ground through engagement in learning and activism for the abolition of war. Towards that end, Tony and I have divided our section into three main parts. So I will start by giving a bit of an introduction to World Beyond War, why it was created, and also why AGSS was written. Tony will then talk next about what is AGSS, how to use it, and who it's for. And then finally, I will follow up with talking about how does AGSS fit into all of the other work that we do at World Beyond War. And really, really important, the now what question: how can you out there listening support, engage, and collaborate with us on this collective effort? So thinking about World Beyond War, we were founded in 2014, and what really sets us apart is that we work to advance the idea of not just ending or preventing any particular war, but abolishing the entire institution on a global scale, and replace this with what we're calling AGSS, the Alternative Global Security System. Fast forward to 2020, we have membership now in 175 countries and counting, and chapters and affiliates around the world. Before we get into looking into detail about the AGSS, let's start off with a couple of questions. The first one is, can we abolish war? So as you're thinking there, you might be logging in via Facebook, via Zoom, you might actually be calling in on your phone. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and you can either play along with us, put your hand up, or nod along with us. How many of you believe that war is either evil? How many of you believe that war is inhumane? Okay, how many of you believe that war, not just the next war or the current war, but the institution of war itself can be abolished? So my assumption is there that some of you are saying yes to a few, and then maybe the last question was a little bit trickier more than the other two questions that we asked. Well, there's an interesting reason for that. Even among anti-war activists and peace scholars around the world, there's a general belief that war isn't and can never be abolished. Why do people hold these assumptions and these beliefs, you might ask? Well, I think part of the answer to this lies in the methodology surrounding war. We hold assumptions about the inevitability of war rooted in false information. These myths are easily enough to debunk with accurate information. For instance, we hold this belief that war is in our genes, when in fact it's not. It's a social invention, not a biological trait. Not only is there no scientific evidence of genetic predisposition to war, there's no viable anthropological evidence to suggest that our hunter-gathering ancestors even engaged in war-making activities. War, as we know it, has only been around for 10,000 years, only 5% of our existence. So part of the educational work of World Beyond War is providing the factual evidence to challenge these claims. But that's not enough. War as a means to resolving international conflict is deeply embedded in our thinking, in our cultures rooted in a predominantly patriarchal gender order reaffirmed by formal education and publicly enshrined in military monuments in nearly every town square, wherever you look around. Interestingly, though, we can turn to anthropologist Margaret Mead, who helps us challenge this deep-rooted culture. She famously declared that war is not in our genes, that it's in fact a human invention, which is good news. If it is a human invention, then we know that human inventions have also faded away based on two conditions. The first one is that the defects of the old invention were recognized. The second one is a new invention is envisioned and designed to replace the old. So let's take a look at the first condition. A lot has been documented about the defects of war. First and foremost, we know that war kills on a massive scale. At least 108 million people were killed in wars in the 20th century. War and preparations for war devastate the environment and harm the planet. Out of control military spending diverts resources and attention from meeting basic human needs. Simply put, militarism and the institution of war breed insecurity, the opposite of what they purport to do. So we know the defects of war, but the question is now, what do we replace the war system with? The second condition is the real educational task of World Beyond War. What new inventions must be designed to replace the old system? What more preferable non-violent alternatives currently exist? What might be imagined? And really, really, really important, how do we move from this transition from the old system to the new? And imperatively, what is our role as human beings in this transition? Well, towards this end and towards these questions, we took a look around at what was being offered, and we found that there was no coherent, targeted approach that people could draw on to understand and take action towards replacing the old war system with the new one in a way that pursues peace by peaceful means. Hence, World Beyond War, we created AGSS, which is our blueprint for ending war. So hopefully that's given a little bit of background in terms of the question of why, the purpose, why World Beyond War, why AGSS. With that background in mind, I now want to turn it over to my colleague Tony, who's now going to talk you through a little bit and lay out what is AGSS, how does it work, and importantly, who is it for? And Tony's going to take you through this now.
Thank you, Phil. You know, I just, one thing I wanted to comment on before we moved is this really striking image that those of you who are joining can hopefully see in the PowerPoint presentation. This image here where it says, "Can we abolish war?" comes from a World War I Great Britain war propaganda poster. And, you know, it just so perfectly shows and illustrates how seamlessly military culture is integrated into the fabric of everyday life. As you look, you know, at the ordinary citizen, the judge, the worker, the proletariat, you can see them just slowly fading into the sort of military order and marching off to war. So obviously this is one of those aspects of this deep-rooted militarism, is one of the aspects of what AGSS seeks to sort of begin to undo. So I want to walk us through some of the kind of broad components that comprise our system. You know, AGSS, as Phil has just alluded to, proposes a path to ending war and establishing an alternative global security system. And we pursue this through three very broad strategies. One is demilitarizing security. Two is managing conflicts without violence, so creating kind of the structures and systems to do that. And three, creating a culture of peace. So these components, they all fit together, they're interdependent and holistically interrelated as part of this broader alternative system. So I'm gonna look as closely as I can in the short few minutes that I have with you at each of these different dimensions of our framework. As you can see here from this very busy, very complicated map, our vision is very dynamic, it's very complex. So I'm just really gonna, you know, scratch the surface a little bit. And for those of you who are familiar with the book, you know, I can't possibly in 10 minutes illustrate to you 150 pages of knowledge, ideas, and practical wisdom, but I'll do the best that I can. So let's start with looking at one of the key components here, demilitarizing security. All right, so our approach here really requires us to begin thinking about how we alleviate our dependence on militarized approaches to security, right? And at kind of a philosophical level, we really want people to walk through and rethink what it is that really makes us secure. All right, rather than understanding security as, you know, hiding behind an iron shield, What if we think of it as something more like the freedom from direct violence, freedom from danger, freedom from threat? And what if we kind of add to our understanding of that, that to be secure means that we're able to reach our full human potential, right? And this implies that, you know, our basic human needs are met, including things like access to food, water, shelter, clothing, healthcare, sanitation, education, these things. But it also implies they're able to live with human dignity, right? To have the insurance that our need to belong, to be in community with others, that these things are not threatened. And this is the essence of human security. And so our framework borrows heavily from this idea of human security, where people are placed above the interests of the nation state. In terms of advocacy for human security, I think many of you might be familiar with World Beyond War's ongoing current 3% campaign. You've probably seen this. Billboards are popping up all around the world with a message that's very simple. The idea that 3% of military spending could end starvation on Earth. And so this is based upon a 2008 UN study that claims that $30 billion a year would be sufficient to end hunger on Earth. So if we do some basic math, if we really look at the US's total military spending, which is close to $1 trillion a year, 30 billion really isn't that much. It's about 3% of annual US military spending, or about 1.5% of global spending. So for those who want to kind of just pursue that further, I'll stop there, but you can visit our website, WorldBeyondWar.org/explained, where you can see how that math adds up and some other arguments. So we're making, you know, this very basic claim that, of course, military spending actually diverts in human needs. Phil mentioned that a minute ago. So I don't think I need to spell out, you know, to our listeners here on the many other ways, of course, in which militarized security actually makes us less secure. Again, Phil already touched on some of those things, but if there are questions about that, we're happy to take them up in the Q&A. So, you know, I'm putting this forward amongst several other rationales that leads us to exploring some strategies for moving away from this highly militarized, very nation-state-centered system of security. And so what AGSS puts forward are several transitionary strategies and some alternative frameworks that might be more preferred. So we kind of balance out these kind of transitions to work within the existing structures, and then put forward our more preferred frameworks as well. So one of the some things we look at are how might we shift to, you know, non-provocative defense postures? How might we take practical steps to support general and complete disarmament? How do we do things, particularly in the context of the US, like phase out our foreign military bases? We have, you know, foreign military bases in some 80 different countries around the world. How do we go about dismantling military alliances, which just really more generally provoke an arms race, you know, rather than actually bring security? We also tackle sort of the deep, very deep entrenchment of the military industrial corporate academic complex. And we put forward some considerations for how we can engage in conversion activities to support the transition to a more peace-oriented economy. And some of the other things that we also look at that are very important, I want to make sure to emphasize here, is the need to increase the role of women in peace and security decision-making and peace-building planning. Moving on to the second component of our system, strategies for managing conflict without violence. These are focused more on reforming or establishing new institutions of global governance, all right, and the tools and processes that we might need in institutions for assuring security. So as a starting point here, I think it's important to point out that we put forward nonviolence as a very normative and a very pragmatic guiding framework for everything that we do here. It's obviously very well documented that nonviolence is more effective than violence at creating sustainable change in the world. For example, many of you are probably familiar with the work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, who co-investigated the history of nonviolent movements. They looked at some 350 odd cases of armed and unarmed interstate insurrections from 1900 to about 2006. And basically what they found is that nonviolent campaigns succeeded 53% of the time, while violent campaigns achieve their goals maybe 26% of the time. So here we see, really easily that nonviolence is roughly twice as effective as violent campaigns. And researchers are learning more and more now about the dynamics and effectiveness of nonviolence and different creative ways to apply it. And we're seeing right now actually a very exciting time in the world with this tremendous rise in nonviolent movements that are popping up. I would encourage people to subscribe to things like Nonviolent News, to just follow what's happening in India, or follow the ongoing efforts and campaigns that are happening in France, challenging these reforms from Macron. So we have all kinds of amazing movements that are being sustained and really challenging dominant structures and systems. But let me get off that a little bit and return to some of the very specific strategies for managing conflict without violence. So one of the things, of course, that we do in AGSS is we identify and analyze many of the weaknesses that are obviously inherent in the UN system. But we look at it still as an important institution for us to work with. It's right now our current institution of global governance. It exists. It has a very obvious heavy emphasis on collective security, which is still really rooted in a militarized paradigm. And there's a lot of challenges, of course, in the UN system of overcoming, national self-interest, sovereignty, the dysfunction of the UN Security Council, things that we're all pretty aware of. So we probe some possible reforms, some hopeful reforms that could strengthen some of the UN's capacities. But we also look at some possibilities for increasing the effectiveness of international law and some other essential international institutions that we might use for managing disputes and conflicts without violence. Also, we look very carefully at strategies for greater participation of civil society. Few people are aware that civilian peacekeeping forces are already serving very, very vital roles in managing conflicts in conflict zones and zones of violence around the world. And these efforts show that where governments are failing, that civilians can step in, especially when, again, governments are found to be failing in their duty to provide the kind of security that they claim to be engaged in. And we also stretched the limits a bit of our thinking. We proposed some pretty bold new ideas and systems for global governance that we believe need to make a shift to being a more representative system of the people that inhabit these systems and not just the representatives of nation states and governments. And last but not least, we look at strategies for nurturing a culture of peace. And these are really vital, visionary, transformative, future-oriented aspects of our work. These strategies are concerned with helping us to establish, new, more peaceful social and cultural norms and values and principles that are necessary for sustaining, a really thriving peace system and the means to be able to spread it globally. We draw pretty heavily upon the UN Declaration and the Program of Action on a Culture of Peace, which observes that progress, I'll quote them here, progress in the forward development of a culture of peace comes about through values, attitudes, modes of behaviors, and way of life conducive to the promotion of peace among individuals, groups, and nations. So a culture of peace also helps us to establish, the important guiding vision of the world that we prefer, the world that we desire. And amongst other strategies, here we put a lot of emphasis to building a culture of peace through peace education, through formal, non-formal, informal peace education work, and also efforts such as peace journalism, amongst others. Now, of course, we recognize that simply producing this book, simply sharing and disseminating this information alone, it's obviously insufficient to the educational task of abolishing war and confronting the worldview of militarism. So, disarming our minds really requires a more transformative pedagogical approach. So we try to embody this in our work and in the book. We do this first and foremost by doing as we're trying to do today, trying to articulate these strategies with clarity. We document the research behind them, show that there's evidence to support these claims, and we illustrate their effectiveness by providing some really concrete examples. Another way that we help sort of illuminate these components, how these components fit together as a system of mutual reinforcing parts, because of obviously pursuing action in just one area is a very fragmented strategy. It's the kind of strategy that's unlikely to lead to sustainable results. So we really seek to articulate the interdependence of each of these functions, right? And I think of utmost importance to our approach, we seek to connect the experience of war and these alternative possibilities to people's lived reality. And that's really important for us. So as long as war remains normative, it's viewed as an abstraction, individuals won't become generally compelled to take action. So the learning has to be personal if it's going to lead to the sort of political engagement that we're about. So one of the ways that we do this to support learners on this more important sort of transformative path, we've also developed Study War No More, which is sort of a companion online study and learning guide, which provides a number of guiding inquiries. So people can use this as a way to kind of study the book independently, but it's also really well designed for facilitating dialogue and discussions in community groups, faith-based groups, and integrated into the classrooms. I've used it quite often in my own introduction to justice and peace studies courses. Just to talk a little bit more about this, this Study War No More guide, it also really helps to bring to life our vision of the AGSS. It features videos and interviews from what we describe as our study and action partners. And these, as you can see here on the screen, these are a number of really amazing leading global thinkers, strategists, academics, activists, advocates. These are all people who are really actively working on developing components of an alternative system. Right. So while our tools are based on the work of these and many other experts, it's also an evolving plan, something that we continue to change and adapt as we gain more experience and more input. And so in a way, we put forward AGSS and Study War No More as an invitation to you to join kind of the dynamic growing movement of learners working for a world beyond war together. So the book has been used by many people. Hopefully some of you have used it. It's inspired a lot of local actions. It's been read by elected officials in the US and abroad. It's been endorsed by Nobel Peace Laureates. You can find summary versions of our book published in several languages online. You can get an audio book version as well. So you can even think about abolishing war in your morning commute. I want to maybe just wrap up really quick and turn it back over to Phill, but I want to return to this quote he mentioned from Margaret Mead, and understanding that war is a human invention. When in her writing, there's sort of a third condition that she's always alluded to that I think is really exciting for me. And so for a human invention to fade away, we also need to believe that social invention itself is possible. And I think that's really what the work of AGSS is about, showing and illuminating that an alternative system is possible. And so getting past the kind of deep-seated pessimism that the war system instills within all of us, it's really no easy task. When Phill asked people to raise their hands, usually we see in audiences, even filled with activists, if few believe that the institution can truly be abolished, right? And that's how deep-seated it is. Even those of us who have deep convictions for peace have a hard time imagining it. And so, what futurists are keen to point out is it's really difficult to imagine and construct preferred worlds, preferred realities. if our visions of the future are guided by the sort of present pessimism that shapes the way we see the world. All right, so if we have this really kind of stark view on the present world, and we end up developing kind of a negative view of the future, so we have this sort of, we're sort of predestined to something terrible. All right, so it shapes our thinking, it shapes our views about what's possible. So we have to shake off these humanly invented chains of the war system and militarism, right? If we're able to move to something that's more desired. Thinking that war is inevitable, it makes it so. Thinking that ending war is possible opens the door. And hopefully through AGSS, you might get some constructive ideas of how we can actually work towards building that alternative system. So I'd love to turn it back over to you, Phill.
Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you. So let's just do a quick check of where we've come from so far before I go on and say a little bit more about where we're going. So hopefully by now, we've covered a little bit about why World Beyond War was created and also why AGSS was written. And that was followed by Tony did a great overview of what is AGSS, how does it work, and who is it for, and in what ways can you engage with it. With that in mind, I want to turn over now and say a little bit about how AGSS fits within the broader scope of our work here at World Beyond War. It provides the foundation for everything that we do, and it's one component of a larger body of work that we do. So as you can see on the PowerPoint presentation, everything that we do at World Beyond War is to address on a global scale the war institution and replace it with a new global security system. One way of thinking about the way in which we do that is through the lens of education and action. And I want to say a little bit more about both of these two components, education and action, and do it for two reasons. One, to give you a better sense of the work that we do. Two, and most importantly, to highlight ways in which you can support, engage with, contribute to this global movement to end the war system. So let's take a look at education. So in the broadest sense, we think of education in terms of needing to look at education about and education for the abolition of war. So our educational materials are based on knowledge and research that exposes the myth of war and illuminates proven non-violent peaceful alternatives that Tony has already touched on. Within that, as per the PowerPoint presentation, if you look on the left-hand side, we have a range of different materials that we use and different resources. So let me say a little bit about these. So for example, we have the books, AGSS. We have online courses that we run. Currently, we're running an online course, War Abolition 101. We have 125 plus peace activists, advocates, and general public interested in the problematic of war that are participating and engaging in this course from all around the world, from South Sudan to global North countries, from teenagers right up to 70, 80-year-olds. So it's a really wonderful learning laboratory where people can engage and learn from each other. We have the Study War No More guide, which Tony has just spoke about. We have our webinars and podcasts, which cover a whole range of themes related to war, peace, and conflict. We have fact sheets that you can access free of charge, and articles, as well as PowerPoints and graphics. And we also host each year an annual conference. Last year, there might be some people on the with us right now that were there last year. It was held in Ireland. This year, it's held in May in Canada. We have the Peace Almanac Project, which looks at peace events throughout the year on each particular day to kind of counteract the overfocus on war and devastation. Let's look at bringing about more stories of peace. And we have the project Mapping Militarization, so you can look and go online on our website to find out information about militarism. And we have our speaker bureau as well. Tony has already spoke a little bit about who some of those global thinkers, decision makers, and influencers are. Under the umbrella of education, please, we encourage you to go on our website, www.WorldBeyondWar.org/education, and you will find all information here related to our books, to our online courses, study guides, fact sheets, etc. With education in mind, while we think it's a necessary component, it's not a sufficient component to bring about the large-scale change that we've been talking about. How do we go about moving from the current war system to a new system where peace is pursued by peaceful means? In this spirit, I often think about Paulo Freire and his ideas of education. Quote, he talks about the idea of education alone cannot change society, but without it, society cannot change either. So in that way, he's acknowledging the critical importance of education as a vehicle through which to bring about social change, but suggests it's not sufficient on its own. Ideally, what's needed is a mixture of education, reflection, and action. So towards that end, I invite you to look at the PowerPoint again and look at the left-hand side. We have a whole range of strategies that we use to support people to organize, to bring about change through action in their communities. So for example, we have closing down. A good starting point to get involved with our work is through signing the Peace Pledge. We support chapters and affiliates all around the world to divest from the war machine, close down military bases, start up a chapter, which I'm sure Greta will talk a little bit about shortly, but it involves 4 events per year, and these 4 events can take from AGSS, take from the Study No More guide, and basically implement peace education events, talks, dialogues, discussions in your community to raise awareness about issues related to the war system and how we go about building a culture of peace. So that hopefully gives you an idea of the education and action components. Before handing it over to some questions, I really want to finish with a call of action of sorts, because although there is viable alternatives out there that are proven to work, that are proven to be a lot more effective than violence, war won't go away on its own. It's not a case of just sitting back and saying, we know non-violence works. We need to work at it together. So really, we want to put out a call to you all to say, we want your help to educate and to mobilize more and more people in the communities where you live, work, and care about, to educate them and to support them to get involved with activities which move us more towards a world beyond war and more towards conditions of peace where peace is pursued by peaceful means. We can't do this alone. We can do a lot more together. So in that way, I want to be very specific in some of the specific activities around the way in which you can support, engage, or contribute to our work. One is by your donations, support us massively to build a movement powerful enough to end war. As Tony spoke about, you can go and purchase our books. So for example, AGSS, $2 download right now, or a free 15-page summary. You can use our free online study and discussion guide posters, online courses, set up a chapter. Please talk to us if you're interested in hosting peace education events in your community. We are available and very, very willing to support you in setting up these particular activities, and we can provide you with resources, organizing assistance to form your own chapters, recruit members, etc. We really, really, really hope that our time here together, for those that are new, will lead to more collaboration moving forward, so we can all work together to push forward the bar with regards to ending war. So that's what I wanted to say under the umbrella of the now what question. So, okay, so you might have been thinking, so, okay, how can we get involved? Hopefully, Tony and I have given you some concrete ways in which we can continue to work together moving forward. So I want to hand that over now to Greta or Mark to kind of moderate some questions and answers. We'd love to hear from you.
Great, thank you so much, Tony and Phil. So now we're opening up to questions and discussion with the audience, and Mark will be moderating this. So if you are joining us via Facebook or joining us via Zoom, you can type in your questions directly in the chat on Zoom or in the comment section on Facebook. You can also just simply unmute yourself if you're on Zoom and ask us a question. If you're calling in with your telephone, you can press *6. That's *6 to unmute yourself and ask a question. And now I'll turn it over to Mark.
Great. Well, thank you, Tony and Phil. And we've got a bunch of good questions already from the chat session, but I think we will have time for a couple more. So please do raise your hand if you're in the Zoom room. And if you're on Facebook, just go ahead and type it in as a comment. And I'm going to start with our friend Al Mitty from Florida. Hi, Al. And I'm just going to read the questions so that we can move quickly through them. You asked, what efforts are being made to get governments, national, local, etc., or NGOs or clubs such as Rotary or other entities such as universities to endorse the AGSS? Any success or progress to report? And that's for Tony or Phil.
Well, I'll turn that over to Phil. I know he's working more currently on that than I am.
So straight away, one of the great questions, thank you so much for that good question. So something straight away springs up, and I'm very curious if you're a Rotarian. So that's something very of interest to me. So lots of efforts are made to approach governments, to approach local authorities, to try and influence them in some way, of course. We cannot make them do that. What we're wanting to do really is to build coalitions, and I think that the chapters that we have as a platform, as people dotted all around the world, are a great resource that we could use to also approach local governments and local authorities, etc., to get AGSS into schools, to get AGSS into Rotary clubs and districts and things like this. So that's one way of answering the question. I don't know, what would you add to that, Tony?
Nothing very specific. I mean, I know you're sort of working on that campaign now, but you know, I think that's exactly it. You know, if you want to buy a copy and bring it to your elected officials, sit down and have a chat with them, that's even more effective than us sending something in the mail. So you know, endorsements are important to get the word out, but sit down and have a conversation with someone. That to me is the bigger part of the strategy.
And yeah, I would also just add to that the AGSS has been implemented in a number of universities, and as well as Tony implementing it in his own classes at the university level. So that is happening. And I would just add an example of the AGSS being distributed to elected officials. We know that it was given to Tulsi Gabbard about a year ago, and based on some feedback that we got from Tulsi Gabbard's staff, we actually made some changes in the latest edition of the book. So we do have that dialogue, and that's very helpful for us and of course for the elected officials.
And one other thing along those lines with regards to the Rotary question, because that was quite a specific one. We've been in contact recently with Rotary, and Rotary have a Rotary Action Group for Peace, and we're due to follow up and have conversations with them in March with regards to discussions around becoming a partner and things like this. So that's a little bit of an answer with regards to the Rotary component.
Okay, let's keep moving. Actually, I'd also like to add to that that Ryan Champeau wrote on Facebook, just finished a study group in Waukesha, Wisconsin, using the book, a great resource. So there's another testimony.
Great to hear that.
So thank you, Ryan. Okay, here's a great question from Juan, and this is actually the question I would like to ask as well. It seems there is no will to end threat of wars because countries trade with weapons and it is an important part of their economies. It is convenient for the industrial military complex to create insecurity between nations. How do you hope to change this state of things?
Oh, can I take this one? I'm really excited about this.
Yes.
I saw that pop up and I'm thrilled. That's actually what I'm talking about with my students tomorrow in class. So this is a great way to sort of prepare myself for it. First, can I like crack a joke for you?
Sure.
So, economists are armed and dangerous. You have to watch out for their invisible hands. Dun, dun, dun. All right, so another joke for you. Maybe not so much a joke. This is a quiz. Who said this? We will have a peace dividend to spend on rebuilding America, beginning with our American inner cities. We're going to rebuild them for once and for all. Any guesses? Greta, Mark, Phil, anyone else?
Trump.
Yes. My students never get that. I think this reveals to us something really promising. There's a fundamental belief that somehow economic conversion from the military-industrial complex is a far-flung fantasy, that people won't support it, especially nobody on the conservative right. But here we have it. There's definitely a universal appeal to creating the peace dividend that we never saw after the Cold War and shifting it to other economic priorities that would make us safer. We have, there's one of the strands of our Study War No More website that focuses on this very specifically. So I'd encourage people to check that out. But Juan, you're absolutely right. The US is the leading arms exporter in the world. The next four are the other permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. So just think about that. Those are the 5 major global arms exporters in the world. And the vast majority of those exports, if they're not being exchanged amongst and between themselves, they're going to places like the Middle East. The challenge is really important. But there's, some general assumptions that we hold that somehow economic conversion, again, is not possible. It can't be done. That our economies are based upon it. But research by a lot of people, going back to sort of one of the preeminent thinkers on this, Seymour Melman, have shown that quite, in fact, it's the opposite. That if we engage in efforts of economic conversion, if they're well planned, it would actually, shifting to a peace economy would actually lead to a net increase in civilian jobs, which are generally better and more well-paying, with some supporting training and others would make a really powerful transition. In fact, some of the most successful transitions we see, like in domestic closed military bases, have been really successful at converting to civilian production and actually diversifying their local economies as a result. So we have precedents. There are efforts to work on this. Historically, there are some modest efforts in the present moment, but a great resource to also look at, one of our partner organizations, the National Priorities Project. If you go to their website, they have this amazing priorities calculator. If you're a US citizen, it's really exciting tool where you can kind of plug in your locality. You can see what percentage of your tax dollars are going to war, how you could reprioritize them to human needs. A really fun tool to kind of experiment with, to rethink how we could prioritize that kind of spending.
Yeah, so I'd just like to add to that as well. A few things come to mind in terms of under the umbrella of war and economics. So the Institute for Economics and Peace are worth checking out with regards to quantifying the economic cost of violence around the world. That's one lens of looking at it. And of course, research shows that $2 trillion is spent on the military and preparing for war, where you can look at UN estimates that it would cost 30 billion to end starvation. So in comparison, you can see how much is being spent on war and preparing for war in comparison to other basic human needs. So when you're making an argument, you have some information there with regards to that. Also, another part of bit of research suggests that for every $1 spent on peace building activities, you save $16 in not actually responding to the economic costs of violence and war. So often I've heard this idea of well, war, actually there's money to be made in war and things like this. Well, this might be the case for the small amount of people, but overall it doesn't make economic costs. So peace building work not only saves lives, it actually saves money as well.
Okay. Great, let's move on. This question is from Paul Anders, and he's saying, I think we need an alliance of nations for mutual aid in implementing nonviolent civilian bases defense. Who wants to field that one?
All I could say is I would agree with you, Paul. And there's a nonviolent peace force which are doing some excellent work around the world along those lines. I'm just going to be in agreement with you.
Yeah, I see that there's another question later on too from John McSod, a similar question: where do we see civilian peacekeeping forces and civilian-based defense happening and working? Well, between peace brigades, nonviolent peace force, Christian peacemaker teams, like Peace Brigades has ongoing efforts in Guatemala, Honduras, New Mexico, Nepal, Kenya. Nonviolent Peace Force active in the Philippines, Myanmar, South Sudan, Syria. One of our advisory members, our board members from World Beyond War, recently just returned from South Sudan. Is John on the call today? I don't hear him chirping in, but maybe he is. He can raise his hand a little bit, and he can mention something about the impacts of their work. But again, we actually have a wonderful interview with the executive director of Nonviolent Peace Force on the Study No War No More site, where she talks a little bit about their strategies and their effectiveness, which is really fascinating. Beyond just sort of intervening in a traditional kind of peacekeeping capacity, in many ways, they're helping to nurture locally sustainable peace building practices that really help sustain the interventions that are happening, and help people kind of create their own localized solutions, which is really fascinating work.
Great. Okay. This is from our Facebook listeners. This is from Nick. He's asking about successes countering realpolitik and influencing security professionals, not just the public. And I mean, I don't know if that needs further, but I think, basically I was wondering the same thing, like, are these ideas actually infiltrating the actual mechanisms which are effective in running foreign policy?
I mean, I'm sure Tony can talk a lot more to that question than I perhaps can. But what I would say on that is that often I hear questions along the lines of, okay, so to what extent are you getting into elite level decision makers and changing, UN decision makers at the elite level, the top level, which is one interesting question. Another way to come at the question is that actually we find that a lot of change actually happens at the global civil society level, from the grassroots to the middle level, informing the powers that be above. So it's not always the case that decisions are made just, I think, the government or a state will make a decision to, I don't know, not invest in this particular war or whatever. People power really, really works. And Tony mentioned earlier about this idea of nonviolence. If you look at one of the principal reasons why nonviolence works is the idea of power, and how many people you can mobilize around this idea of nonviolence is a lot more in comparison to how many people you can mobilize around violence itself. So I'd really, although elite levels are very, very important, I like this idea of John Paul Lederach, who talks about working at the grassroots up, elite level top down, and middle outwards. So I think we need to work at all levels. And I'm sure Tony can say a little bit more about the elite levels.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a satisfying answer to it, at least in terms of those who are deeply engaged in the security apparatus of nations. I think there are some things that obviously make it a challenge. Realpolitik is very much a worldview that's very difficult to overcome. I'm always shocked when I get students at the university who are studying in the traditional security studies program, and all they've heard is realism, 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 and then they encounter my courses, and it turns their whole world upside down. And every effort I make to sort of build a bridge of dialogue with those folks is not been easy. But that being said, there are some promising things we see. We partner a lot with like Veterans for Peace and others, a lot of former military leadership that play a really important role in challenging these ideas. We've had former presidents that Eisenhower, who stuck his neck out in a way to challenge the military-industrial complex. So there are people there, but are we getting our hands in there? I don't know. Is that the strategy we need to pursue? Not necessarily, as Phill has pointed out. I think the strategy is maybe more middle out or bottom up for what we need to do. Kind of supporting, looking at it systemically again. Disarming security, managing conflict without violence, creating a culture of peace. We can have a strong impact through that groundswell of citizens advocating for change as well.
Okay, I think we're going to have time to get all the questions that have been asked in. We probably have no time for more questions, but I'm now going to ask Marshall Burns to unmute yourself, Marshall, and you can ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So we think of war as generally something that we think of as prosecuted at the level of nations. But when we have this, one of the prongs in the objectives of the organization is demilitarization. And we have increasingly militarization at the intra-national level in the form of police and also the prisons. And police and prisons are another great source of violence in our society. And my question is, does World Without War limit itself to the notion of violence at the level of inter-nation war, or do we also look at the intra-nation violence of police, prisons, and others?
Great question. I mean, the short answer to that is, war is a manifestation of the belief in militarization and in militarism, which is where we're seeing, we're seeing that trickle down into community policing practices and in our prison system. So absolutely, those are components of the war system that we need to address as well. That's the short answer to a really long, lengthy discussion, but.
Yeah, so trickling down in terms of to police and prisons and things like this, and to an extent as well, which was alluded to earlier as well, in our school system as well, in the way in which we're approaching education as well. You can see this idea of militarization and the war system playing out in those contexts as well.
Great, thanks very much.
Cool. Okay, I don't think we want to run over time too much, but we do have a couple more. This is from our friend David Hartsoe. Hi, David. Is AGSS being used in peace studies programs around the world? How do we encourage that in other universities and colleges? And there, I'm actually mixing the rest of that. Oh yeah, that's the end of it. Good, that's the question.
Tony, do you want to go at that one first?
Well, I mean, part of it is I think we know we need to do a better job of getting a sense of where it is being used. And Phill can lay out, we've talked a little bit about a strategy very recently about how we might get a better idea of that. But it is certainly and absolutely being used. And we'll try to get back to you, David, with a more helpful, thorough answer as to actually where.
Yeah, not much more else to add to that, but yeah, I think Tony's kind of addressed that question.
Expect a survey soon.
Yeah.
Okay. This is from Tim, and I'm not going to read this whole thing, but he's basically, the beginning is, I think the new thing in the world today is climate change, and that problem cannot be solved while defense remains our highest priority. In the chat, Tim also mentions a book reference, but in interest of time, climate change, how does that affect this whole?
Yeah, I actually answered that question on the chat box, but for those of you who aren't viewing the chat, I'll just summarize what I said, which is absolutely. Our work at World Beyond War is very intersectional. We look at the institution of war holistically. So we look at war's impact on the environment, its social impacts, its economic impacts, the way that militarism fuels racism, etc. All of those cross connections, because war is really at the nexus of so many societal and environmental problems. So I put a link in the chat to WorldBeyondWar.org/environment. I encourage you to look at that webpage. It has a fact sheet, various videos and articles and other resources, making that cross connection with war and climate change. And we actually did our No War 2017 conference in Washington, D.C. entirely on this subject. So it was a multi-day conference just focusing on war's environmental impact.
And along those lines as well, just to add to that, there's discussions with regards to looking at in the future an online course looking at war and the environment. So watch this space.
Yep, great. Also, somebody just mentioned that we should mention global challenge. Does any of you want to mention that in any way? Explain what the global challenge is.
Sure, we can mention something about that. You know, so AGSS is an award-winning book. We should probably come up with a new cover that has, you know, a fancy little badge on there. So the Global Challenges Foundation, a year or so ago, issued a challenge to educators around the world to put forth plans that would put forward alternative visions for global governance and solutions to global shared challenges. And so I put together a wonderful package and nomination based on AGSS and our Study War No More Guide. And we are one of the founding recipients of the Educators Challenge Prize, which was awarded last year in London at the London School of Economics.
Cool. Okay, great. So going back.
I'll just add to that quickly that I put the link in the chat for those of you that want to follow that and watch Tony's speech for accepting his award and read about that award.
Yes, there's actually a lot of good stuff in the chat, a lot of good links, etc. Okay, going back, this is from John. Where is civilian peacekeeping forces? Actually, I think we may have addressed this one already, but where is, did we address this one already, I think? I think we kind of skipped around. Okay, great. So this is from Kate, and I think this can be our last question. How do you convert the thinking of those who have a deep vested interest in the war culture, whose financial and emotional survival depends on maintaining the war system? And I think that's a big enough question that maybe you both want to answer it.
So you want to start us off?
Well, it perhaps gets at this idea of psychology, which I'm very much interested in. And I think Tony touched on it earlier as well. Unless you make something, connect something to the personal, then, you know, what's in it for them? and perhaps how they might be, impacted in a negative way, then that's, it's very difficult. You cannot change, you cannot make somebody do something. What you can do is provide an environment and provide information and data so that they can make informed decisions. Obviously, I come from a very positive outlook and think that people can be trusted to make the right decisions when they have the right amount of information. Second to that, there's this idea of mobilization. And if you mobilize lots of people and put force on whoever you're thinking about, it shows that that is a strategy that works, and people do tend to change their policies, their strategies, and their ways of working. So I think there's something there with regards to the individual themselves, making the decision for themselves, but also being influenced by lots of people outside to try and inform their decision. Great question.
Yeah, I don't know what much more I can add to that, other than to say, I think it starts with a lot of with an inquiry, really inviting people to think again about this fundamental question: what really makes us secure? And if we can get people to really intentionally reflect on that question, it may kind of begin to shake some of the foundations of the presumptions they have about their need for militarized security, both financially and emotionally for their survival needs. I think that's a starting point, but critical self-reflection is the first and foremost thing that we really need to be able to do that. And so even again, like as I argue, sometimes it's not even about informing people of the facts. It's about getting them to critically engage with those ideas, to see how they fit with their worldview and their understanding of the world. Oftentimes we just kind of filter those things out if they don't align with how we already see the world as it is. So ask the questions instead. Don't try to force the idea on those people, but really get them to understand what matters to them the most and why. Why do they think they need that investment in militarism? How does that really protect them, make them more safe, more secure? Could there be an alternative way to do that that might give you a better life?
Great. Okay, well, there are a couple of follow-ups in the chat session for anybody who wants to read them, but I do think it's a good idea to keep these webinars to the allotted time. So over to you, Greta.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Mark and Tony and Phil and all the participants for joining us today. That's a wrap for today's webinar on the alternative global security system. We will be sharing this recording, and we'll share a list of resources that we referenced throughout this conversation. So if you did register for the webinar, you'll receive a follow-up email with all of that information. And I encourage you to go to our website, WorldBeyondWar.org, to get involved in all of our many campaigns, from peace education to divestment to closing military bases. Thank you again, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.